The rain had been falling over Ashford Park for 3 consecutive days, and Edward Ashford, the 5th Earl of Greystone, stood by the tall window of his study, watching the water streak down the glass in silent rivulets. His reflection stared back at him, a man of 32 years, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell just so across his forehead and eyes the color of winter storms. He had been told more than once that he possessed the kind of face that belonged in portrait galleries. Angular, aristocratic, unreadable. He had cultivated that unreadability with the same precision he applied to every other aspect of his life. Behind him, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm amber light across the mahogany desk where papers lay scattered. Estate matters, correspondences from London, invitations he had no intention of accepting. Edward did not care for society's frivolities. He had married to secure his line, as was expected of a man of his station, and having done so, he saw no reason to indulge in the performative niceties that others seemed to require. His wife. The word settled uncomfortably in his mind, as it always did. Lady Catherine Ashford. She had been Catherine Pemberton before their marriage 2 years prior, the only daughter of Viscount Pemberton, a man whose estate bordered his own. The arrangement had been logical, beneficial to both families, and entirely devoid of sentiment. Edward had not sought a love match. He had sought efficiency, compatibility of rank, and a woman who would not disrupt the order of his household. Catherine had seemed perfect for the role. She was quiet, well-mannered, accomplished in all the ways a lady of her standing should be. She played the pianoforte beautifully, spoke French with flawless pronunciation, and moved through the rooms of Ashford Park like a graceful shadow. She never complained, never made demands, never raised her voice. She never spoke unless spoken to. This had pleased Edward. Initially, he valued silence, order, the absence of chaos. His own childhood had been marked by his mother's hysterics and his father's thunderous rages, and he had vowed that his own household would be a place of control and calm. Catherine, with her downcast eyes and measured words, had seemed the ideal partner in this endeavor. But lately, though Edward could not say precisely when it had begun, something had shifted. He would enter a room and find her standing by a window, much as he was now, staring out at nothing in particular. When he addressed her, she would turn with that same polite smile, answer his questions with that same soft voice, and yet there was something absent in her gaze, something that had once been there in those first months of their marriage and had slowly, imperceptibly faded away. Edward told himself it did not matter. Their marriage was not meant to be a romance from one of those ridiculous novels his sister Augusta insisted on reading. It was a partnership, a duty, a continuation of ancient lines and honored traditions. Catherine had her role, he had his. That was sufficient. The door to his study opened without warning, an intrusion he would have found intolerable from anyone else, but Augusta had never been one to respect boundaries. "Edward, you cannot possibly spend another evening locked away in here," his sister announced, sweeping into the room with her usual theatrical flair. She was 26, unmarried by choice, and possessed a frankness that both irritated and amused him in equal measure. "You have a wife, you realize, a living, breathing woman who dines alone every night while you brood over ledgers." "I do not brood," Edward replied, not turning from the window. "I work. Some of us have responsibilities, Augusta." "Yes, and one of those responsibilities is to your wife." Augusta came to stand beside him, following his gaze out into the rain-soaked gardens. "When did you last have a proper conversation?" "With Catherine. And I do not mean asking her to pass the salt at dinner." Edward's jaw tightened. "My relationship with my wife is not your concern." "Perhaps it should be someone's concern," Augusta said quietly. "She is fading, Edward. Surely even you have noticed." He had noticed, of course he had noticed, but acknowledging it would require him to examine why he had allowed it to happen, and that was a path Edward had no intention of walking. "Catherine is perfectly well," he said firmly. "She has everything she could possibly need. Comfort, security, position, everything except a husband who sees her as more than a piece of furniture." The word struck something deep in Edward's chest, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "You overstep, Augusta." "Good." His sister turned to face him fully. "Someone needs to. Do you know what I observed today?" I came upon Catherine in the music room. She was sitting at the pianoforte, but she was not playing. She was simply sitting there with her hands in her lap, staring at the keys. When I asked if she was well, do you know what she said? Edward did not answer. She said, "I have forgotten the notes." Can you imagine? Catherine, who plays more beautifully than anyone I know, claiming she has forgotten how to play. Augusta's voice softened. She is disappearing, Edward, right before our eyes, and you are so wrapped up in your precious control that you cannot even see it. Before Edward could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door. They both turned to see Catherine herself standing in the doorway, and Edward felt an unexpected jolt in his chest at the sight of her. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that brought out the delicate coloring of her complexion. Her honey blonde hair was arranged simply with a few curls framing her face. She was lovely. She had always been lovely, but there was something ethereal about her now, as though she were not quite fully present in her own body. "Forgive me," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not mean to interrupt. I only wondered. Lord Fairfax has arrived from London. He said he has business to discuss with you, my lord." Edward noted the way she addressed him. Not Edward, not my dear, not even husband. Always my lord, as though they were strangers conducting a formal transaction. "Thank you," he said. "Please have him shown to the drawing room. I will join him shortly." Catherine nodded, that same polite, distant expression on her face. She began to turn away, but Augusta spoke up. "Catherine, will you not join us? Surely whatever business Lord Fairfax has cannot be so terribly important that we must all be driven apart this evening." For the briefest moment, something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or longing. But it vanished so quickly, Edward thought he might have imagined it. "I would not wish to intrude," Catherine said softly. "You could never intrude in your own home," Augusta insisted. Could she, Edward? Edward found himself caught between his sister's expectant gaze and his wife's carefully blank expression. The correct answer was obvious, and yet the words caught in his throat. He was not accustomed to having his household routines disrupted, not comfortable with the unpredictability of social situations that he had not carefully orchestrated in advance. "Of course not," he said finally, hearing the stiffness in his own voice. "You are welcome to join us if you wish." "If I wish," Catherine repeated, and there was something strange in the way she said it, as though she were tasting the words and finding them bitter. "How generous of you, my lord." She said it without inflection, without obvious sarcasm, and yet Edward felt the rebuke as clearly as if she had struck him. Before he could respond, Catherine had already turned and disappeared down the corridor, her footsteps silent on the thick carpets. Augusta gave him a long, meaningful look. "You see?" she said. "Fading." Edward did not reply. He moved past his sister and out into the hallway, following the path Catherine had taken toward the drawing room. His mind was working in that rapid, analytical way it always did when presented with a problem to solve, cataloguing observations and drawing conclusions. Catherine was unhappy. That much was becoming clear. But why? He had given her everything: position, security, freedom from want. He did not gamble, did not keep mistresses, did not drink to excess or treat her with cruelty. He was, by all reasonable measures, an exemplary husband. And yet, when he entered the drawing room, he found Catherine standing near the window again, always the windows, he realized, always looking out at something he could not see, while Lord Fairfax, a jovial man of middle years with a tendency toward gossip, was settling himself into one of the chairs with obvious pleasure. "Greystone. Excellent, excellent. I hope you do not mind my arriving unannounced. But I was passing through on my way to Bath and simply could not resist stopping to share the most extraordinary news from London." Edward took his customary seat, noting the way Catherine remained by the window, apart from them. She had not sat down. She stood like a ghost at the periphery of the room, present but not participating. "What news?" Edward asked, more from politeness than genuine interest. "It concerns your old friend, Richard Blackwood. You remember him, surely? Bit of a rake in his youth, though he has settled admirably. His family's estate is in Derbyshire, I believe. In any case, he has just returned from Italy, and he is absolutely transformed. The continent has done him a world of good. He speaks of art and music and poetry as though he had been born to it." Lord Fairfax chuckled. He was always the romantic sort, even at Cambridge. Do you recall how he used to write verses and leave them scattered about the place? Edward did remember. Richard Blackwood had been his closest friend at university, though they had seen little of each other in recent years. Richard had always been everything Edward was not: warm, expressive, unguarded in his enthusiasms. Their friendship had been one of opposites, and Edward had valued it precisely because Richard had never demanded that Edward become something he was not. "I had heard he was traveling," Edward said. "I did not know he had returned." "Oh yes, just last month, and he has expressed particular interest in reconnecting with old friends. I took the liberty of mentioning that you were in residence here at Ashford Park, and he seemed quite eager to visit, if you would permit it." Before Edward could respond, a sound drew his attention. Catherine had moved slightly, and the silk of her dress had whispered against the furniture. When he looked at her, he found that she was watching him with an expression he could not quite decipher. "Mr. Blackwood was always very kind," Catherine said softly. "On the few occasions we met." Edward had forgotten that Catherine had met Richard briefly at their wedding. Richard had been one of the few guests Edward had actually wanted in attendance, though the two men had barely had opportunity to speak amid the formalities of the day. "He thought very highly of you, Lady Greystone," Lord Fairfax said warmly. "He told me as much, said you were wasted on this somber fellow here." It was meant as a joke, a bit of harmless teasing, but Edward felt his shoulders tense. The implication that Catherine might be better suited to someone like Richard, someone who could appreciate her finer qualities, struck him as almost offensive, though he could not say exactly why. "Richard is welcome to visit, if it pleases him," Edward said, his voice coming out colder than he had intended. "Though I imagine he will find country life rather dull after the excitement of Italy." "Oh, I think he is quite done with excitement," Lord Fairfax said. "He speaks now of settling down, of finding a place of peace, of—" He paused meaningfully. "Of marriage, perhaps." The room seemed to grow very quiet. Edward could hear the rain against the windows, the crackle of the fire, the soft sound of Catherine's breathing. He forced himself not to look at her, though he was acutely aware of her presence in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. "How fortunate for him," Edward said. "I hope he finds what he is looking for." "As do I," Catherine said, so softly that Edward almost did not hear her. "As do I." Edward did not sleep well that night. He lay in his own chamber, separate from Catherine's, as was proper and expected, and stared at the canopy above his bed, turning over the events of the evening in his mind with the same methodical precision he applied to his estate accounts. Something had shifted in Catherine during Lord Fairfax's visit. He had seen it in the way she held herself, heard it in those few words she had spoken. There had been an edge to her voice, a barely perceptible defiance that was so unlike her usual careful docility that it had unsettled him. And the mention of Richard Blackwood, that too had produced a reaction. Edward was not so unobservant that he had missed the slight change in Catherine's expression when Richard's name was spoken, the way her fingers had tightened almost imperceptibly against the fabric of her dress. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Catherine had met Richard precisely twice in her life. There was no possibility of any attachment between them, and yet the thought lodged itself in Edward's mind like a splinter, small and irritating and impossible to ignore. The truth was that Edward had never fully examined his own feelings about his marriage. He had not believed feelings to be particularly relevant. Marriage was a contract, a meeting of families and fortunes, a practical arrangement that served both parties. Love was an indulgence, a weakness that led to the sort of chaos and misery he had witnessed in his own parents' union. His mother had loved his father, desperately, painfully, with a fervor that had bordered on madness, and his father had wielded that love like a weapon, withholding affection when it suited him, bestowing it when he wished to manipulate her. Edward had grown up watching his mother diminish herself year after year until there was almost nothing left of the vivacious woman she had once been. He had sworn he would never allow love to have such power over him. He had sworn he would never allow anyone to matter so much that their absence could destroy him, and so he had chosen Catherine precisely because he had not loved her. She was suitable, agreeable, safe. She would not disrupt his carefully constructed life. She would not demand more than he was willing to give, except now it seemed She was demanding nothing at all, and somehow that felt worse. Edward rose from his bed as dawn broke grey and cold over the estate. He dressed. Himself. He had always preferred to do so without the assistance of a valet when possible, finding the ritual of another man's hands on his person distasteful, and made his way down to breakfast. He expected to find the morning room empty, as it usually was at this hour. Instead, he found Augusta already seated at the table, reading a letter with an expression of barely suppressed delight. "You are up early," Edward observed, helping himself to coffee from the sideboard. "As are you." Could not. "Sleep? Guilty conscience, perhaps?" Edward ignored this. "What are you reading that has you looking so pleased with yourself?" "A letter from Richard Blackwood," Augusta said, and Edward's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "He writes that he will be arriving tomorrow afternoon. He says he is eager to see Ashford Park again, and to become reacquainted with all its inhabitants, including, he mentions specifically, your wife." "Catherine is mentioned as a courtesy," Edward said, forcing his voice to remain even. "Nothing more." Augusta set down the letter and fixed him with one of her penetrating stares. "You know, Edward, I have always thought you rather foolish where Catherine is concerned, but I had not realized you were also blind. I beg your pardon? You do not see what is happening, or perhaps you do see it and simply refuse to acknowledge it." Augusta leaned forward. "Catherine is lonely. She is desperately, achingly lonely, and you have made her so. I have given her everything, except yourself, except any genuine warmth or companionship or interest in her thoughts, her feelings, her existence beyond her utility as the Countess of Greystone." Augusta's voice was sharp now. "You treat her like a servant to whom you are unfailingly polite. Do you know what she said to me yesterday when we were walking in the garden?" Edward did not want to know. He could feel something dark and uncomfortable unfurling in his chest, but he could not stop himself from asking. "What did she say?" "She said that she sometimes wonders if you would even notice if she disappeared, if one day she simply was not here anymore." She said it with such calmness, Edward, as though it were merely an observation, not a cry for help. The word struck Edward with unexpected force. He set down his coffee cup, suddenly unable to stomach it. She was being dramatic. Was she? Can you honestly say you have paid her any real attention in the past year? When was the last time you had a conversation with her that was not about household matters or social obligations? When was the last time you asked her opinion on anything of substance? When was the last time you looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw an actual person rather than a role being performed? Edward felt anger rising in him, hot and defensive. "I have always treated Catherine with the utmost respect. Respect is not the same as care, and it is certainly not the same as love. I never promised her love." The words came out harsher than Edward had intended, and in the silence that followed, he heard how cold they sounded. Augusta's expression shifted from frustration to something closer to pity. "No," she said softly, "you never did. But perhaps she hoped for it anyway. And perhaps over the past 2 years, she has finally accepted that such hope is futile." Edward turned away, moving to the window. He seemed to spend half his life at windows now, staring out at nothing, and tried to organize his thoughts. He was not a cruel man. He did not wish Catherine to be unhappy, but neither did he know how to be what she apparently needed him to be. He had built his entire life around control, around keeping his emotions carefully contained. To let that control slip, to allow himself to feel the things he had spent years suppressing, the thought terrified him in a way he could not articulate. "Richard's arrival may be a good thing," Augusta said, more gently now. "He is warm and kind, and treats people as though their feelings matter. Perhaps his presence will remind you of what it looks like to engage with the world openly. Or perhaps," Edward said quietly, "it will remind Catherine of everything she did not get when she married me." Augusta did not respond to this, and Edward knew he had accidentally spoken a truth that neither of them had wanted to acknowledge. The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended tension. Edward attempted to focus on estate business, but found his mind wandering repeatedly to thoughts of Catherine, of Richard, of the strange sense of foreboding that had settled over him like a shroud. He saw Catherine only once, in the afternoon, when he happened to pass the music room and heard the sound of the pianoforte. He paused outside the door, listening. She was playing something melancholic, a piece he did not recognize, and she played it with such feeling that it seemed to seep through the walls and wrap around his heart. Edward stood there for several minutes, his hand raised to push open the door to enter the room and perhaps... What? Speak to her? Ask her if she was well? Tell her that he had noticed her unhappiness and it troubled him more than he knew how to express. But he did not open the door. He stood there, frozen by his own inability to act until the music stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, he heard something that made his breath catch. Catherine was crying. It was very soft, almost imperceptible, but Edward's hearing had always been acute. He heard the quiet, hitching breaths, the sound of someone trying desperately not to be heard, and something inside him, something he had kept locked away for so long he had almost forgotten it existed, cracked just a little. He should go to her. He should open the door and ask what was wrong and offer comfort, however awkwardly. That was what a husband should do. That was what any decent person would do. But Edward did not move. He stood there, his hand still raised, and slowly, silently, he let it fall back to his side. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, leaving Catherine alone with her tears. That evening, at dinner, Catherine did not come down. A maid brought word that her ladyship was unwell and would be taking her meal in her rooms. Edward sat at the long dining table with only Augusta for company, the empty chair where Catherine should have been like an accusation. "She is not unwell," Augusta said, pushing food around her plate without eating. "She simply cannot bear to face you. You do not know that. I know it with absolute certainty. Just as I know that when Richard arrives tomorrow, you will see exactly what you have been too stubborn to see before." "And what is that?" Augusta looked at him with something close to sadness. "That it is possible to lose something precious without ever having realized you possessed it in the first place." Edward did not respond. He finished his meal in silence, excused himself, and retired to his study, where he poured himself a brandy he did not want and sat staring into the fire until the flames burned low and the room grew cold around him. He was still sitting there, glass in hand, when the clock struck midnight, and as he sat in the darkness, Edward allowed himself to acknowledge for the first time the terrible truth he had been avoiding. He had wanted a marriage without love, because love frightened him. But in protecting himself from the vulnerability of caring, he had created something far worse, a marriage without joy, without warmth, without any real connection at all. He had sought to avoid the pain he had seen his mother endure, and in doing so, he had inflicted a different kind of pain, the slow, grinding misery of indifference. And now Richard Blackwood was coming. Richard, who had always been everything Edward was not. Richard, who would smile at Catherine and speak to her as though her words mattered and treat her with the kind of warm attention that Edward had never thought to provide. And Catherine, lonely and fading, might very well turn toward that warmth, like a flower toward the sun. The thought should not have bothered him. This was a practical marriage after all. Catherine's happiness or unhappiness was not supposed to matter beyond its effect on the smooth running of his household. But as Edward sat alone in his study, staring into the dying fire, he was forced to acknowledge something he had never expected to feel: jealousy, sharp, bitter, and utterly undeniable. Richard Blackwood arrived at Ashford Park on an afternoon that had turned unexpectedly bright, as though even the weather wished to celebrate his presence. Edward watched from the window of his study as the carriage rolled up the drive, gleaming black and perfectly appointed, and felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. He had told himself repeatedly that Richard's visit was nothing to concern him. They were old friends. It was natural that Richard should wish to reconnect after his time abroad. There was no reason for Edward to feel this uncomfortable tension in his chest, this prickling awareness that something was about to change in ways he could not control. And yet the feeling persisted. Edward descended to the entrance hall just as Richards was being admitted by the butler. His old friend looked well, better than well, actually. Italy had bronzed his skin and put a vitality in his eyes that Edward did not remember from their university days. Richard had always been handsome in an open, approachable way that contrasted sharply with Edward's own austere features, but now there was a sophistication to him, a worldliness that spoke of experiences Edward had never sought. "Edward!" Richard's face broke into a genuine smile as he crossed the marble floor, hand extended. "Good God, it has been far too long. You look exactly as I remember, stern and imposing and altogether too serious." Despite himself, Edward felt a small smile tug at his lips. "And you look as though you have been enjoying yourself excessively. Italy, I take it, was agreeable?" Agreeable hardly begins to describe it. The art, the music, the pure beauty of it all. I feel as though I have been living in grey for most of my life and only now discovered colour. Richard gripped Edward's hand warmly. "But I have missed England. I have missed my friends. I am very glad to be here." They moved into the drawing room, where Augusta was already waiting, practically vibrating with pleasure at having a new person to interrogate. Catherine, Edward noted, had not yet appeared, though he knew she had been informed of Richard's arrival. The three of them fell into easy conversation, or rather, Richard and Augusta conversed while Edward listened, contributing the occasional observation. Richard spoke enthusiastically about his travels, about the paintings he had seen in Florence, the opera in Milan, the extraordinary architecture of Venice. He spoke with his hands, with his whole body, in a way that Edward found both alien and oddly mesmerizing. It was only when Richard paused to take a breath that he seemed to remember something. "But where is Lady Greystone? I had hoped to pay my respects." "Catherine has been somewhat unwell," Augusta said, shooting Edward a meaningful glance, "though I believe she is recovered now. Shall I send for her?" "Only if it would not be an imposition," Richard said. "I remember her as being quite lovely and remarkably accomplished. I trust married life has agreed with her." There was an awkward pause. Edward felt Augusta's eyes on him, waiting for him to respond, but he found he did not know what to say. Had married life agreed with Catherine? By what measure would one judge such a thing? "Catherine is well," Edward said finally, aware of how inadequate the words were. "She manages the household admirably." Richard's expression flickered with something Edward could not quite identify, surprise perhaps, or disappointment. But before he could respond, the drawing room door opened and Catherine appeared. Edward felt his breath catch, though he could not have said why. She wore a dress of ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and throat, and her hair was arranged in a style that framed her face softly. She looked lovely, as she always did, but there was something different about her today. A brightness in her eyes, a hint of color in her cheeks, as though some inner light had been rekindled. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice warm in a way Edward had not heard it in months. "What a pleasure to see you again." Richard rose immediately, moving forward to take her hand with an ease that made Edward's own formalities seem ridiculous by comparison. "Lady Greystone, the pleasure is entirely mine. You are even more beautiful than I remembered, if such a thing is possible." It was a compliment any gentleman might pay, perfectly appropriate, and yet somehow intimate in the way Richard delivered it. Edward watched his wife's cheeks flush with actual pleasure, watched her smile, a real smile, unguarded and genuine, and felt something twist sharply in his chest. "You are too kind," Catherine said, and there was a lightness in her voice that Edward recognized from their courtship, from those first few months of their marriage, before everything had gone quietly, inexorably wrong. "Please do sit. I want to hear everything about Italy. I have always longed to travel there." They settled into conversation with an ease that Edward found distinctly uncomfortable. Richard spoke about the Italian countryside, the vineyards and olive groves, the way the light fell across the Tuscan hills at sunset. Catherine listened with rapt attention, asking questions, laughing at Richard's anecdotes, responding with observations that revealed an intelligence and curiosity Edward had somehow failed to notice in their daily interactions. Or perhaps he had simply never bothered to draw it out of her. "You must visit someday," Richard said earnestly. "I cannot imagine anyone with your sensibilities not being absolutely transformed by the experience. The art alone. There is a Botticelli in the Uffizi that I stood before for nearly an hour, unable to move. I kept thinking that if beauty could be distilled into a single image, it would be that painting." "How wonderful to feel something so deeply," Catherine said softly, and there was a wistfulness in her voice. That made Edward shift uncomfortably in his chair. "I think I should like to feel that way about something, to be so moved that one cannot look away." "Have you never felt that way?" Richard asked, and his tone was genuinely curious, not merely polite. Catherine's eyes flickered briefly to Edward, then away again. "Perhaps once," she said, "a long time ago, but I think I have forgotten how." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Edward could feel but not quite grasp. Augusta cleared her throat delicately, breaking the moment, but Edward continued to watch his wife, seeing her in a way he had not seen her in months. She was engaged, animated, present in a way she never was with him, and Richard was the catalyst for that transformation. Over the following days, Richard settled into Ashford Park as though he had always belonged there. He walked in the gardens with Catherine, discussing literature and art. He played chess with Augusta in the evenings. He accompanied them all to church on Sunday and charmed the vicar's wife. He was in every way the perfect guest, and with each passing day, Edward watched his wife bloom under Richard's attention like a plant that had been kept too long in darkness. It should not have mattered. Edward told himself this repeatedly. Catherine's happiness should be, in its way, a relief. If Richard could provide her with the companionship Edward had failed to offer, surely that was a positive development. It freed Edward from the uncomfortable obligation of trying to be something he was not, and yet it did matter. It mattered with an intensity that shocked him. Edward found himself noting every smile Catherine gave Richard, every laugh, every moment when their heads bent together over a book or a piece of sheet music. He found himself making excuses to be in whatever room they occupied, standing at the periphery like a spectre at his own life. He found himself lying awake at night, imagining conversations. They might be having connections they might be forming. He found himself, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, consumed by jealousy. The breaking point came on the evening of the 6th day of Richard's visit. There was to be a small dinner party, nothing elaborate, just a few neighboring families, and Catherine had planned it with more care than Edward had seen her invest in anything in months. She wore a gown of deep emerald that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, and her hair was arranged with small flowers woven through the curls. She looked radiant, more beautiful than Edward could remember seeing her, and when Richard entered the drawing room before dinner and his face lit up at the sight of her, Edward felt fury rise in him like a tide. "Lady Greystone," Richard said, moving to her side with that easy grace Edward could never replicate. "You are an absolute vision. Greystone, you are the most fortunate of men." Edward should have agreed, should have smiled, and nodded, and played the role of satisfied husband. Instead, he heard himself say coldly, "Catherine is always impeccably presented. It is one of her duties as mistress of this house." The words fell like stones into water, creating ripples of shocked silence. Catherine's smile faltered. Richard's eyebrows rose. Even Augusta across the room looked appalled. "I meant no disrespect to duty," Richard said carefully. "But surely a husband's appreciation extends beyond the merely professional." "I appreciate my wife's competence," Edward said, and even to his own ears he sounded insufferable. "As I appreciate the competence of my steward and my housekeeper. Each has their role. Each performs it admirably." "Edward," Augusta said warningly. But Edward was not finished. Something dark and ugly had been building in him all week, and now it was spilling out unchecked. "Though I suppose, Richard, that you have always had a tendency to romanticize what ought to be practical. It is a charming trait in its way, but not one particularly suited to the actual business of managing an estate and a household." "I see," Richard said quietly. His expression had gone neutral, carefully polite. "I had no intention of interfering with your business arrangements." Catherine made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and then she turned and walked rapidly from the room, her emerald skirts swishing behind her. Edward watched her go, that twisted thing in his chest tightening. Further, but he did not follow. He stood there, rigid and furious and utterly unable to articulate why. "That," Augusta said into the silence, "was inexcusable." "I spoke only the truth," Edward said. "You spoke like a man terrified," Richard said, and there was sadness in his voice now. "Edward, I have known you for 15 years. I have never seen you like this. What has happened to you?" Edward could not answer. He did not know how to explain that watching Richard and Catherine together had made him realize what he had willfully refused to see, that his marriage was not a successful business arrangement, but a slow-motion tragedy. That Catherine was not simply performing a role, but dying inside while doing so. That he had failed her in every way that mattered, and now it was too late to rectify it. Because she had already found someone who could give her what Edward could not. The dinner party was a disaster. Catherine did not return, sending word through a maid that she had developed a headache. The guests were polite but clearly uncomfortable, sensing the tension that permeated the household. Edward moved through the evening like an automaton, speaking when spoken to, performing his duties as host with mechanical precision. When the last guests had finally departed, Richard approached him in the hallway outside the drawing room. "Edward," he said gently, "I think perhaps I should leave tomorrow. My presence here seems to be causing distress, and that was never my intention." "Do as you please," Edward said, not meeting his friend's eyes. "You always have. I want you to understand something." Richard's voice was serious now. "Whatever you believe you have seen between myself and Lady Greystone, you are mistaken. I have offered her only friendship, and she has accepted only that. But Edward," he paused, "she is desperately unhappy. Surely you can see that." "Catherine has everything she needs," Edward said automatically. "Everything except a husband who truly sees her." Richard shook his head. "I do not know what has made you this way, so closed off, so determined to feel nothing, but I do know that it is destroying something precious. And if you do not find a way to change, you will lose her. Perhaps not physically, but in every way that matters, you will lose her." "She is my wife," Edward said, and heard the defensiveness in his own voice. "She is bound to me. Legally, yes. But there are other kinds of bonds, Edward. Bonds of affection, of respect, of genuine partnership. And those bonds, once broken, are not so easily repaired." Richard reached out as though to grip Edward's shoulder, then seemed to think better of it. "I hope for both your sakes that you realize this before it is truly too late." He walked away, leaving Edward standing alone in the hallway. Above him, he could hear the faint sound of crying from Catherine's chambers, and he knew he should go to her, should apologize for his behavior, should try to explain. The confused tangle of emotions, he did not fully understand himself. But he did not go to her. Instead, Edward climbed the stairs to his own rooms, closed the door, and stood in the darkness, listening to his wife weep. And for the first time in his adult life, Edward Ashford, the 5th Earl of Greystone, felt truly afraid. Richard departed the next morning, as promised, his farewell brief and tinged with a sadness that lingered in the air long after his carriage had disappeared down the drive. Edward watched from his study window, always the windows, always watching, and felt the weight of guilt settle more heavily on his shoulders. Catherine had not come down to say goodbye. She had sent her regards through Augusta, who delivered them with such pointed coldness that Edward knew exactly what his sister thought of his conduct. And perhaps she was right to think ill of him. Perhaps they all were. The house felt different after Richard's departure, emptier somehow, though that made no logical sense. One guest more or less should not alter the essential character of a place, and yet the silence that descended on Ashford Park in the days that followed felt oppressive, heavy with things unsaid, and damage that could not be easily undone. Edward tried to return to his usual routines, estate business, correspondence, the careful management of his affairs, but found his concentration fractured. He would sit at his desk with papers before him and realize he had been staring at the same page for 20 minutes without comprehending a single word. He would walk the grounds and find himself stopping outside the music room, listening for the sound of the pianoforte, only to be met with silence. Catherine had stopped playing. She had stopped doing many things, actually. She no longer walked in the gardens. She no longer sat in the drawing room in the evenings. She took her meals in her chambers, claiming fatigue or headaches or some other vague indisposition. When Edward encountered her in the hallways, which was rare as she seemed to have developed an uncanny ability to avoid him, she would offer a polite nod and move past before he could speak. She was disappearing even more thoroughly than before, and this time Edward could not pretend not to notice. 10 days after Richard's departure, Augusta cornered Edward in the library. She did not bother with pleasantries. "You need to speak with her," she said without preamble. "This cannot continue." "Catherine is entitled to privacy if she wishes it," Edward replied, not looking up from the book he was pretending to read. "Privacy is not the same as isolation. She is wasting away, Edward. She barely eats. She does not sleep. I hear her pacing at night. And when I try to speak with her, she smiles that terrible empty smile and tells me she is perfectly well. Augusta moved to stand directly in his line of sight. You did this, and you are the only one who can undo it. I do not know how, Edward said, and was shocked to hear the raw honesty in his own voice. I do not know what she wants from me. She wants you to care, Augusta said, her voice gentler now. She wants you to see her as more than a set of duties fulfilled. She wants... Augusta paused, seeming to weigh her words. She wants you to love her, Edward. Or at the very least, she wants you to try. Love. The word felt foreign, dangerous, impossible. Edward had spent his entire adult life constructing walls against such vulnerability, and now his sister was asking him to simply demolish them, as though it were the easiest thing in the world. I do not know if I am capable of that, Edward said quietly. Then you need to let her go. The words struck him like a physical blow. What? If you cannot give her what she needs, then you need to release her from this miserable half-life she is living. Let her go back to her father's house. Give her space to breathe again. This slow suffocation you have created for her. It is cruel, Edward, whether you intend it to be or not. She is my wife, Edward said, hearing the echo of the words he had spoken to Richard. She is bound to me. Then act like a husband, Augusta snapped. Stop hiding in your study and your silences and your precious control, and actually fight for your marriage. Because right now there is nothing left to fight for. Catherine has already surrendered. She left him then, and Edward sat in the library alone, Augusta's words, reverberating through his mind. Let her go. The thought was unbearable, and yet what right did he have to keep her if all he could offer was this emptiness? That evening, Edward made a decision. He would speak to Catherine. He would apologize, perhaps. Try to explain. Find some way to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. It would be uncomfortable and awkward, and he would likely make a hash of it. But he had to try. He found her in the conservatory at dusk, standing among the ferns and orchids, her figure illuminated by the last golden rays of sunlight streaming through the glass. She wore a simple dress of pale grey, and her hair was unbound, falling in soft waves down her back. She looked ethereal, untouchable, like something from a dream. "Catherine," he said, and she turned slowly, unsurprised by his presence. "My lord," she replied, and the formality of it stung. Edward stopped, realizing he had no idea what to say. The words he had rehearsed in his mind seemed inadequate now, foolish. "I wish to speak with you." "Then speak." There was no warmth in her voice, no anger either, just a terrible flatness that was somehow worse than any emotion. "I know I have not been..." Edward struggled for the right words. "I know that you have been unhappy, and I regret that." Catherine's expression did not change. "Do you?" "Of course. I never wished to cause you distress." "No, you simply did not wish to know about it." She moved slightly, a fern frond, brushing against her skirt. "Tell me, Edward, and I want you to answer honestly, do you even remember the last time we had a conversation about anything other than household management?" Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. He could not remember. Surely there had been such conversations, but he could not call a single one to mind. Catherine nodded, as though his silence confirmed something. "Do you know what day this is?" she asked quietly. "It is Thursday," Edward said, confused by the question. "It is our anniversary. 2 years ago today, we were married." Catherine's voice remained eerily calm. "I remembered. I even thought perhaps that you might remember as well, that perhaps you might acknowledge it in some small way, but of course you did not, because to acknowledge it would require you to think of our marriage as something more than a contractual arrangement." Shame flooded through Edward, hot and acrid. He had forgotten. He had actually forgotten their anniversary. What kind of husband was he? "Catherine, please do not apologize," she interrupted. "I do not think I could bear it if you apologized, because it would be meaningless, Edward. Just more words, just more empty courtesy. You would say you were sorry, and then nothing would change. We would go back to our separate lives under the same roof, and I would continue to fade until there was nothing left of me at all." "That is not what I want," Edward said, and realized with sudden clarity that it was true. "I do not want you to fade. Then what do you want? Catherine asked, and there was a spark of something in her eyes now. Anger, perhaps, or desperation. Tell me, Edward, for once in 2 years, tell me what you actually want. I want. Edward felt panic rising in him. What did he want? He did not know how to answer that question, because he had spent so long not allowing himself to want anything beyond control and order and the absence of pain. I want you to be happy. Catherine laughed, and it was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. No, you do not, because if you wanted me to be happy, you would have paid attention when I stopped being so. You would have noticed when I stopped playing the pianoforte, when I stopped reading, when I stopped smiling. You would have cared enough to ask why. I care, Edward said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. Of course I care. Do you? Or do you simply care now because someone else has shown interest in me? Because Richard treated me as though I were a person rather than a piece of furniture. Catherine's voice rose slightly. Tell me truthfully, Edward, if Richard had never come here, would you even be having this conversation? Or would you have continued on indefinitely content in your isolation? Edward could not answer, because they both knew the truth. I thought so, Catherine said softly. She turned back toward the window, her profile sharp against the darkening sky. I want you to know something, Edward. When we married, I had believed that perhaps given time we might learn to care for one another. That affection might grow between us. I did not expect passion or grand romance. I knew you were a reserved man, but I thought there might be kindness, companionship, a genuine partnership. Catherine, let me finish. Her voice was steady now, resolved. For 2 years, I have tried to be what you needed. I have been quiet when you wanted silence. I have been present when you required a hostess, and absent when you did not want company. I have performed every duty, met every expectation, and in return, you have treated me with scrupulous politeness and complete indifference. That is not true, Edward protested. I have never been indifferent. Yes, you have. Catherine turned to face him fully now, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes, though her voice remained controlled. You have been so indifferent that you did not even realize I was dying. Inside. Do you know what it is like, Edward? To live with someone who looks right through you, to speak and know your words do not matter, to exist in a constant state of being tolerated rather than wanted. The pain in her voice broke something in Edward's chest. I did not know, he said hoarsely. Catherine, I did not know it was so bad. I thought you were content. Content, she repeated. Yes, I suppose I must have seemed content, because I learned very quickly that any expression of unhappiness was unwelcome, that you preferred your household calm and ordered, with no messy emotions to disturb your peace. She wiped at her eyes impatiently. But I am not content, Edward. I am miserable, and I cannot do this anymore. Fear spiked through him, sharp and immediate. Cannot do what? This. Us. This pretense of a marriage. Catherine drew a shaky breath. I have thought about this carefully, and I believe it would be best if I returned to my father's house for a time, a separation. Time for both of us to consider what we truly want from this union. No. The word came out too loud, too desperate. No, Catherine, that is not necessary. We can work through this. Can we? She looked at him with such sadness. How, Edward? What would you change? Would you suddenly become a different person? Would you suddenly be able to give me the warmth and attention you have withheld for 2 years? Would you suddenly care about my thoughts, my feelings, my existence beyond my usefulness to you? I could try, Edward said, and heard the pleading note in his own voice. Give me the chance to try. Catherine shook her head slowly. I do not think you can change. I think this is who you are. A man who keeps the world at arm's length because intimacy terrifies him, and I cannot live with that anymore. I cannot continue to slowly disappear. You are not disappearing, Edward said desperately. You are right here. No, Catherine interrupted. I am not the person I was, the person I could have been. She is gone, Edward. You suffocated her with your indifference. And what is left is just a ghost, a shadow. I barely recognize myself anymore. Edward took a step toward her, then stopped, unsure if his presence was wanted. If I have done this to you, then let me fix it. Catherine, please, do not leave. Why? The question was simple, direct. Give me one good reason why I should stay. Because I need you, Edward thought. But the words would not come. Because the thought of you gone makes me feel like I am falling. Because I have been a coward and a fool, and I do not know how to be anything else, but I am willing to try, if you will just stay. But he said none of this. He stood there, his mind frantically searching for the right words, the perfect argument that would change her mind, and found nothing but panic and fear. The silence stretched between them, painful and telling. That is what I thought, Catherine said finally. You cannot even tell me why our marriage is worth saving. You cannot name a single thing about me that you value beyond my ability to manage your household. You cannot, her voice broke, you cannot even pretend to love me. I do not know how to love, Edward said, the confession torn from him. I do not know if I am capable of it. My parents, what they had, it was poison, Catherine. It was obsession and manipulation and misery, and I swore I would never allow myself to be vulnerable in that way. I swore I would never give anyone that kind of power over me. So you chose to feel nothing instead. Catherine's eyes were full of tears now. You chose to protect yourself so thoroughly that you forgot how to be human. Yes, Edward said simply. Yes, I did. And I thought it was enough. I thought if I could just maintain control, maintain order, then I would be safe. Happy, even. But I was wrong. He took a step closer. Richard was right about me. I'm terrified. Terrified of caring. Too much of needing anyone, of allowing myself to be hurt. And in protecting myself, I have hurt you. I see that now. Seeing it is not the same as changing it, Catherine said. I know. But perhaps, Edward swallowed hard, perhaps understanding is the first step. Catherine, I cannot promise I will transform into the kind of husband you deserve. I cannot promise I will suddenly become warm and demonstrative and emotionally available, but I can promise that I will try. I can promise that I see you now, truly see you, and that the thought of losing you is more frightening than anything I have ever felt. For a long moment, Catherine simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, "It is too late, Edward." The words struck him like a death sentence. It cannot be too late, but it is. Because even if you tried, even if you somehow managed to change, I would always wonder if it was real, or if you were simply going through the motions out of duty. I would. Always wonder if you actually cared for me, or if you just did not want to face the scandal of a separation. She turned away from him. I deserve more than that. I deserve to be with someone who wants me, not someone who merely wishes to avoid losing me. Catherine, please go, she said, her voice breaking. Please, Edward, just go. Edward stood there, every instinct screaming at him to stay, to fight, to refuse to accept this ending. But he did not know how to fight for something he had never properly valued. He did not know how to convince her of feelings he had only just begun to acknowledge himself. So he did, as she asked. He turned and walked out of the conservatory, each step feeling like a betrayal, and left his wife standing alone among the flowers and ferns as darkness fell around her. That night, Edward did not go to his study. He went to his chambers and sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. And sometime past midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, hesitant footsteps. Pause outside his door. He held his breath, waiting, hoping. But the footsteps moved on, and a few moments later, he heard the distant sound of Catherine's door closing, and Edward realized, with devastating clarity, that he had already lost her. The question was only whether the loss was irreversible, or whether he could find, somewhere within himself, the courage to become the man she needed him to be. But courage had never been his strong suit, where matters of the heart were concerned. And so he sat in the darkness, alone, and wondered if it was truly too late to save the one thing he had never known he wanted until it was slipping through his fingers. Catherine left 3 days later. It was raining again. It seemed to Edward that it was always raining now, as though the heavens themselves mourned what was being lost. He stood at the window of his study and watched as her trunks were loaded into the carriage that would take her back to her father's estate in Gloucestershire. She had asked for a month, perhaps two, to think and rest and remember who she was outside the suffocating confines of their marriage. Edward had not argued. What right did he have to argue when he had created the very circumstances that made her departure necessary? He did not go down to see her off. She had not asked him to, and he suspected his presence would only make things more difficult for both of them. Instead, he watched from above as Augusta embraced Catherine on the drive, as his wife climbed into the carriage with that same ethereal grace she brought to everything. As the door closed and the horses began to move, Catherine did not look back at the house. Not once. The carriage disappeared down the drive, swallowed by rain and mist, and Edward stood at the window long after it had gone, his hand pressed against the cold glass, as though he might somehow reach through it and call her back. But he did not call her back. He simply stood there until the glass grew warm beneath his palm, until Augusta found him there, and led him gently away to the fireside, until the day faded into a night that felt impossibly empty. The house was different without Catherine in it. Edward had not expected this. She had been so quiet, so unobtrusive, that logic suggested her absence should barely be noticeable. But instead, everywhere Edward looked, he saw the spaces where she should have been. The pianoforte in the music room, silent and gathering dust. The chair by the fire where she had sat with her needlework. The gardens she had tended, now overgrown in her absence. Augusta stayed for a week after Catherine's departure, but eventually she too had to return to London for prior commitments. Before she left, she stood in the entrance hall and fixed Edward with a long, searching look. "You know what you need to do," she said. "Do I?" Edward felt hollowed out, incapable of certainty about anything. "Yes, you need to decide if your pride is worth more than your marriage. You need to ask yourself if the safety of feeling nothing is truly preferable to the risk of feeling everything." Augusta reached up to adjust his cravat in a gesture so reminiscent of their late mother that Edward felt his throat tighten. "And then, Edward, you need to fight, actually fight. Not with words or logic or that formidable intellect of yours, but with honest feeling. You need to show Catherine that you can change, that you have changed. Otherwise, you will lose her forever." "I may have already lost her," Edward said quietly. "Perhaps. But you have not yet tried to get her back. And trying, even if you fail, is better than this passive resignation." She kissed his cheek. "Write to her. Go to her. Do something, Edward, before it truly is too late." After Augusta left, Ashford Park fell into a silence so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Edward moved through his days like a ghost in his own life, tending to estate business mechanically, eating meals he did not taste, sleeping poorly when he slept at all. He thought about writing to Catherine constantly. A dozen times, he sat at his desk with paper and pen before him, trying to find words adequate to express what he felt, but everything he wrote seemed insufficient, false or melodramatic. How could he explain, in a letter, the strange alchemy that had occurred in him since her departure? How could he make her understand that losing her had taught him the value of what he had possessed? In the end, he did not send any of the letters. He burned them one after another and watched the words turn to ash. 2 weeks after Catherine's departure, a letter arrived from her father, Lord Pemberton. Edward opened it with shaking hands, fearing news of some catastrophe, some final severing of ties. Instead, he found a brief, formal note informing him that Catherine was well and requested that her personal items, specifically her books and music, be sent to Gloucestershire. The tone was cool, distant, and did not invite response. Edward read the letter 3 times, searching for some hidden message, some sign of what Catherine was thinking and feeling. But there was nothing, just a polite request, as though they were strangers managing shared property. He personally oversaw the packing of Catherine's belongings, her books, carefully wrapped, novels in French, poetry, histories, her sheet music, some of it annotated in her delicate handwriting. A small watercolor set she had never mentioned, but had apparently used to paint the landscapes that hung in her private sitting room. As Edward handled these items, he realized how little he knew about his wife. These objects told stories he had never thought to ask about. Here was evidence of interests and passions he had never inquired after, talents he had never sought to understand. She had been living a full interior life right beside him, and he had been too willfully blind to see it. Among her music, Edward found something that made him pause. A composition, handwritten, titled simply, Ashford Park, July 1843. The date was from their first summer together, those early months when he had still believed their marriage might be a success simply because it was orderly and calm. He sat down at the pianoforte, something he had not done since his own childhood lessons, and attempted to play the piece. His fingers were clumsy on the keys, his rhythm uncertain, but gradually, the melody emerged. It was beautiful and melancholic, full of longing and restraint, and Edward realized with a shock that this was how Catherine had heard their home, not as the refuge of calm he had intended, but as a place of beautiful sadness. She had tried to tell him, in the only language she had available, and he had never bothered to listen. Edward finished the piece badly, his fingers stumbling over the final notes, and then he sat at the piano bench with his head in his hands and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had lost. That night he dreamed of Catherine. She was walking away from him through an endless garden, always just out of reach no matter how quickly he walked. He called her name, but she did not turn. And when he finally caught up to her, when he finally touched her shoulder, she turned to face him and she was transparent, a ghost, barely there, and she said, "I told you I was disappearing." He woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, and knew with absolute certainty that he could not simply wait and hope that time would heal what he had broken. The next morning, Edward made arrangements. He would go to Gloucestershire. He would see Catherine, speak to her properly, without the familiar battleground of Ashford Park surrounding them. He would try to explain, to apologize, to somehow demonstrate that he was not the same man who had driven her away. But when he arrived at the Pemberton estate 3 days later, he was met not by Catherine but by her father. Lord Pemberton was a stern man in his 60s, with the bearing of a military officer and eyes that saw too much. He received Edward in his study with formal courtesy and no warmth whatsoever. "I am afraid Catherine is not receiving visitors at present," he said before Edward could even make his request. "I am not a visitor," Edward replied, fighting to keep his voice even. "I am her husband." "Are you?" Lord Pemberton's gaze was sharp. "Because from what I have observed, you have been rather remiss in that role." The rebuke stung precisely because it was deserved. "I know I have failed Catherine," Edward said quietly. "I am here to make amends." "Words are easy, Lord Greystone. My daughter has heard many words from you, I am sure. What she needs now is time and peace, neither of which your presence would provide." "I disagree. What she needs—" "With respect," Lord Pemberton interrupted, his voice hardening. "You have spent 2 years demonstrating that you do not know what my daughter needs. I will not have you continuing to distress her with your belated attentions." Edward felt desperation rising in him. "Please, I'm asking only for the chance to speak with her, to apologize properly. Surely I have that right." "You have the legal rights granted to you by marriage," Lord Pemberton said, "but the right to her time, her attention, her willingness to listen, those must be earned, and you, sir, have not earned them." "Then how do I earn them?" Edward heard the rawness in his own voice and could not bring himself to care. "Tell me what I must do." Lord Pemberton studied him for a long moment. "I do not know if there is anything you can do at this point. Catherine came to me devastated, Lord Greystone, utterly devastated. She has spent 2 years being made to feel worthless, invisible, tolerated at best. Do you understand what that does to a person, especially to someone as sensitive and intelligent as my daughter? I never intended—" "Intention is irrelevant. Impact is what matters, and the impact of your neglect has been profound." The older man's expression softened slightly. "I do not think you are a cruel man, Lord Greystone. I think you are a damaged one, but that does not give you license to damage others." Edward absorbed this, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. "You are right," he said finally, "about all of it. I am damaged. I have been damaged since childhood, and I thought if I could just control everything, keep everyone at a distance, I would be safe from the kind of pain I saw my parents inflict on each other. But in doing so, I have inflicted a different kind of pain, and I would give anything to undo it." Lord Pemberton sighed. "The question is not whether you would undo it if you could. The question is whether you can be different going forward. And that, Lord Greystone, is something only you can answer. I want to be different, Edward said. I want to be the husband Catherine deserves. I know I do not know how, but I am willing to learn. I am willing to try. If she will give me the chance, then write to her, Lord Pemberton said. Not demanding, not commanding. Write to her as though she is a person you wish to know, not a possession you wish to reclaim. And perhaps she will respond. But do not expect it to be easy, and do not expect forgiveness to come quickly, if it comes at all. Edward left the Pemberton estate with a strange mixture of despair and determination. He had not been allowed to see Catherine, but neither had the door been permanently closed. There was still hope, however fragile. That night, back at his rooms at the inn, Edward wrote a letter. He wrote and rewrote it a dozen times, discarding draft after draft, until finally he produced something that felt honest if inadequate. Dearest Catherine, I do not know if you will read this letter. I do not know if you even wish to hear from me, but I must try to tell you what I have been unable to express in person. You were right about everything. I have been a coward, hiding behind formality and distance because I was afraid of being hurt as I saw my parents hurt each other. In protecting myself, I destroyed the one thing that might have brought me genuine happiness, a true partnership with you. I cannot claim that I have suddenly transformed into a different person. Old habits and fears do not disappear overnight. But I can tell you that your absence has taught me something I was too blind to see while you were beside me. That a life without risk, without vulnerability, without the possibility of being hurt, is not safety. It is merely a different kind of death. You said you did not know if I could change. I do not know either, but I want to try. Not because I wish to avoid scandal, not because I need a competent manager for my household, but because I have realized something that terrifies me. I miss you. Not the idea of you, not the role you played, but you specifically. Your presence, your thoughts, your gentle voice, the way you looked at the gardens in the morning light. I do not know if this is love. I do not have enough experience with love to name it with certainty. But it feels like something precious that I possessed and did not value until it was gone. I'm not asking you to return immediately. I'm not even asking you to forgive me, though I hope someday you might. I'm only asking that you allow me the chance to prove, through actions, rather than words, that I can learn to be better. Whatever you decide, know that I will respect your choice. You deserve happiness, Catherine. If you believe you can find that happiness with me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn that trust. And if you believe you cannot, then I will find a way to live with that loss, knowing I have only myself to blame. Yours, Edward. He sent the letter the next morning and returned to Ashford Park to wait for a response that might never come. Days passed. Then, weeks. The estate moved through the rhythms of late summer into early autumn, and Edward moved with it, performing his duties mechanically, while his mind remained fixed on a silent manor in Gloucestershire, where his wife might or might not be reading his words. Finally, 6 weeks after Catherine's departure, a letter arrived bearing her handwriting. Edward took it to his study and sat staring at it for 10 full minutes before he could bring himself to break the seal. His hands shook as he unfolded the single sheet of paper. Edward, I have read your letter many times since it arrived. I wanted to respond immediately, but my father counseled patience, and I think perhaps he was wise to do so. These matters should not be decided in haste. You ask if you can change. I do not know, but I have realized something. The more important question is whether I can trust you enough to witness that change, whether I am strong enough to risk being hurt again. I have spent these past weeks trying to remember who I was before our marriage, trying to find the girl who loved music and books and believed that the world held possibilities. She is still there, I think, buried under the weight of disappointment and loneliness. But recovering her will take time. You say you miss me. I do not know if I can say the same. What I miss is the hope I once had, the belief that our marriage might become something real. Whether that hope can be resurrected is a question I cannot yet answer. I will not return to Ashford Park immediately, but I am willing to meet with you, to speak honestly about what would need to change for our marriage to be bearable, if not joyful. My father has suggested that we might spend time together in neutral territory. perhaps in London, where we might learn to interact as two people rather than as entrenched opponents. I offer this not because I have forgiven you, but because I am not yet ready to give up entirely on what we might have been. If this is acceptable to you, you may write to arrange a meeting." Catherine Edward read the letter 3 times, analyzing every word, every phrase. It was not a warm letter. It was not even particularly hopeful, but it was not a rejection either. It was an opening, however small. And for the first time since Catherine had left, Edward allowed himself to feel something that might have been hope. They met in London 6 weeks later, in the drawing room of Augusta's townhouse on Grosvenor Square. Augusta had volunteered her, home as neutral ground, and Edward was grateful for his sister's intervention, even as he chafed at the lack of privacy. He arrived early, unable to help himself, and spent 20 minutes pacing the elegant room while Augusta watched with poorly concealed amusement. "You look as though you are preparing for battle," she observed from her chair by the window. "Perhaps I am," Edward replied, adjusting his cravat for the 3rd time. "Catherine is not your enemy, Edward. She is your wife. Try to remember that." Before Edward could respond, the door opened and Catherine entered. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that brought color to her cheeks, and her hair was arranged more elaborately than Edward had seen it in months. She looked well, better than well, actually. There was a clarity in her eyes that had been absent at Ashford Park, a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She was beautiful, and looking at her now, Edward felt a surge of something he could only describe as longing. So intense it nearly knocked him off balance. "Catherine," he said, and heard his voice come out rough, uncertain. "Edward." She inclined her head politely, but did not move closer. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, I would have come sooner if you had allowed it." "I know." Catherine moved to take a seat by the fire, and Edward noticed the way she positioned herself with careful precision, close enough to be conversational, far enough to maintain distance. "But I needed time to think about what I truly want, rather than simply reacting to hurt and anger." Augusta rose from her chair. "I shall leave you two to speak privately. I will be in the library if you need me." After his sister departed, an awkward silence settled over the room. Edward remained standing, unsure whether to sit near Catherine or maintain the physical distance she seemed to require. "Please sit," Catherine said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You are making me nervous, hovering like that." Edward sat, though every instinct urged him to cross the space between them, to kneel before her and beg forgiveness in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. But he had promised himself he would be guided by her comfort, not his own impulses. "You look well," he said, then immediately felt foolish. Was that truly the best opening he could manage? "I am well," Catherine replied. "The distance has been clarifying." "Yes, I imagine it has been." Edward paused, searching for the right words. "Catherine, before we discuss anything else, I need to say something. I need to apologize, properly, not the inadequate attempts I have made before." She watched him with those clear, assessing eyes, and said nothing. "I was a terrible husband," Edward continued, forcing himself to hold her gaze. "Not through cruelty or deliberate malice, but through profound neglect. I treated our marriage as though it were merely an administrative matter, and I treated you as though you were an employee rather than a partner. I made you feel invisible, worthless, and alone. And for all of that, I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Catherine's expression flickered with something, pain perhaps, or recognition, but she still did not speak. "I told you in my letter that I did not know if I could change," Edward went on. "I still do not know with certainty, but I have spent the past 3 months trying to understand why I behaved as I did, and I think I finally see it clearly." "Tell me," Catherine said softly. Edward drew a deep breath. This was the difficult part, the admission that felt like stripping himself bare. "My parents had a toxic marriage. My mother loved my father desperately, and he used that love to control and manipulate her. I watched her lose herself piece by piece until she was merely a shell, existing only to serve his whims and endure his rages. And I swore I would never allow myself to be in that position. I would never love anyone so much that their absence could destroy me." "So you chose to love no one at all," Catherine said, and there was understanding in her voice, though not absolution. "Yes. I thought if I could just maintain control, keep my heart carefully guarded, I would be safe. I chose you specifically because I did not love you, because I thought a marriage of practical partnership would be sufficient." Edward saw Catherine flinch slightly at these words, but he forced himself to continue. "But I was wrong. A marriage without affection is not safety. It is prison for both parties." "I see," Catherine said quietly. "And now, what has changed?" "I have," Edward said simply. "Or rather, I am trying to change. Catherine, when you left, I finally understood what I had lost. Not the convenience of a well-run household, not the social acceptability of marriage, but you, the actual person you are. Your intelligence, your gentleness, your quiet strength. The way you see beauty in things I had stopped noticing. The way your presence made Ashford Park feel less empty." Catherine's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Those are lovely words, Edward, but words have never been our problem. You have always been eloquent when the situation demanded it. The question is whether you can sustain feeling beyond the moment of crisis." "You are right to doubt me," Edward acknowledged. "I have given you no reason to trust that this awareness will last. But Catherine, I am not here to make promises I cannot be certain of keeping. I am here to ask, to beg if necessary, for the chance to prove myself through actions over time." "What kind of actions?" Catherine leaned forward slightly. "Be specific, Edward. I need to understand what you think a real marriage would look like." Edward had thought about this question constantly. It would mean spending time together not out of obligation, but because we choose to. Having conversations about things that matter to both of us. Learning your interests and sharing mine. Allowing you to see my vulnerabilities rather than always projecting strength. Making you feel heard, valued, essential, not to the functioning of the household, but to my own well-being. "And physical affection?" Catherine asked, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Our marriage has been... we have not..." "I know," Edward said quickly. "I know I have failed you in that regard as well. I told myself I was being respectful by not imposing, but the truth is I was simply avoiding intimacy in all its forms. If you were willing. To try again, I would hope to change that, but only at a pace that makes you comfortable." Catherine was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to believe you, Edward, but I am so afraid." "Of what?" Edward asked gently. "Of hoping again. Of opening myself up to disappointment. Of becoming that fading ghost I was at Ashford Park." She turned to look at him, and now the tears did fall. "You hurt me, Edward. So deeply. And I do not know if I can survive being hurt like that again." Edward did something he had never done before. He left his chair and knelt on the floor before Catherine, taking her hands in his, though his entire body trembled with the vulnerability of the gesture. "Then do not decide now," he said urgently. "Do not tell me yes or no. Tell me you will let me try. Let me prove, over weeks and months, that I can be different. Let me court you, Catherine, the way I should have done from the beginning. Let me learn who you are and show you who I am beneath all the defenses." "And if you fail?" Catherine asked through her tears. "If you try and cannot sustain it, then at least we will both know we made every effort before accepting defeat." "But Catherine," Edward squeezed her hands gently, "I do not think I will fail, because for the first time in my life, I want something more than I fear it. I want you, your presence, your companionship, perhaps even your love, more than I fear. To the vulnerability that comes with admitting that." Catherine searched his face for what felt like an eternity. "You said in your letter that you did not know if what you felt was love." "I do not," Edward admitted. "I do not have enough experience with the emotion to name it with certainty. But I know that your absence has been unbearable. I know that I think of you constantly. I know that when I imagine the future, I cannot bear the thought of it without you in it. If that is not love, it is at least the beginning of something that might become love." "Show me," Catherine said suddenly, fiercely. "Show me what you felt when I was gone. Do not tell me in pretty words. Show me." Edward was not sure what she wanted, but he acted on instinct. He released her hands and reached up to frame her face gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not their first kiss. That had been at their wedding, a brief formal touch of lips that meant nothing, but it was the first kiss that mattered. Edward poured into it everything he could not adequately express, his regret, his longing, his desperate hope that it was not too late. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Catherine's eyes were wide and startled. "I have never kissed you like that," Edward said hoarsely. "I have never allowed myself to. But Catherine, I want to. I want to kiss you as though you are precious to me, because you are. I want to hold you and know you and be known by you. I want to build something real between us, not the hollow mockery we have been living." Catherine raised a shaking hand to her lips, as though she could still feel the press of his mouth against hers. I did not expect, nor did I," Edward admitted. "But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the things worth having are the things that surprise us, that push us beyond what we thought we were capable of." Catherine stood abruptly, and for a terrible moment Edward thought she was going to leave, to tell him it was not enough that he had destroyed too much to ever rebuild. But instead, she held out her hand to him. "Get up off the floor, Edward. You look ridiculous." He rose, accepting her hand, and found himself standing mere inches from her. This close, he could see the flecks of green and gold in her eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "I am not ready to return to Ashford Park," Catherine said. "Not yet, but I am willing to try this courtship, as you called it. I am willing to spend time together, to let you prove that you can be the partner you claim you want to be." Relief flooded through Edward so intensely he felt lightheaded. "Thank you, Catherine. I swear to you I will not waste this chance." "I hope not," she said, and there was a ghost of a smile on her lips. "Because there will not be another one." Over the following weeks, Edward courted his wife as though they had never been married at all. He called on her at Augusta's townhouse at proper visiting hours. He took her to exhibitions at the Royal Academy, where they discussed paintings and discovered they shared similar tastes in landscape art. He accompanied her to the opera, where he watched her face more than the stage, fascinated by the play of emotion across her features. He learned that she loved Greek mythology and had taught herself to read Latin. He discovered that she had a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to employ it. He found out that she was passionate about the plight of working women and had been secretly donating her pin money to charitable causes that supported them. With each conversation, each shared experience, Edward felt the distance between them diminishing. But he was careful never to push, never to demand more than Catherine was willing to give. When he touched her, it was with obvious care, a hand on her elbow. As he helped her into a carriage, his fingers brushing hers as he passed her a cup of tea. Small gestures that spoke of tenderness rather than ownership. And slowly, gradually, Catherine began to soften toward him. One evening, nearly 2 months into their courtship, they were walking in Hyde Park as dusk fell. The air was cool with approaching autumn, and Catherine had tucked her hand through Edward's arm as they walked. "I have been thinking," she said suddenly, "about what you said, about not knowing if what you feel is love." "Yes?" Edward's heart began to beat faster. "I think perhaps love is not something you know with certainty," Catherine continued, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "I think it is something you discover over time, through 1,000 small moments. And Edward," she paused, turning to look up at him, "I think perhaps I am discovering it now, with you." Edward stopped walking, his breath catching. "Catherine, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "For 2 years I believed I was married to a man who could never care for me. And then when you finally showed me attention, I was afraid to trust it. Afraid it was merely a performance designed to bring me back under your control. But I do not think that anymore." "What do you think now?" Edward asked softly. "I think you were telling the truth when you said you were damaged. I think you have spent most of your life protecting yourself from feeling anything, and breaking through those defenses is genuinely difficult for you. But I also think—" Catherine reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his jaw. "I think you are trying, truly trying. And that means everything to me." "I do not want to be damaged anymore," Edward said, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not want to live behind walls, Catherine. I want to live with you, fully, honestly, without reservations." "Then live with me," Catherine said simply. "Come back to Ashford Park. Let us try to build something real. There, together." Edward felt tears prick his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that he did not try to hide. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel pressured." "I am certain," Catherine interrupted. "I am not the same woman who left Ashford Park 3 months ago, Edward. I am stronger now, strong enough to fight for what I want. And what I want—" She paused, seeming to gather courage. "What I want is a real marriage with my husband." Edward pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as relief and joy and a dozen other emotions he could not name flooded through him. "You will have it," he promised against her hair. "Catherine, I swear to you, you will have everything I am capable of giving. And if that is not enough, I will find a way to give more." "It will be enough," Catherine whispered, "as long as it is real, as long as you truly see me." "I see you," Edward said fiercely. "I see you, Catherine, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it." They stood there in the growing darkness, holding each other, until the park lamps began to flicker on around them, and a gentle rain began to fall, the same rain that had marked the beginning of their separation, now marking the tentative beginning of their reconciliation. They returned to Ashford Park together one grey morning in November. Edward had offered to prepare the household for Catherine's return, but she had refused, saying she wanted to walk in with him, to begin this new chapter together, rather than as separate individuals occupying the same space. The servants lined up to greet them in the entrance hall, and Edward saw genuine warmth in their faces as they welcomed Catherine home. She had always been kind to the staff, he realized. Another thing he had failed to notice. Another way she had brought grace to a household he had run with cold efficiency. That first night, they dined together in the smaller family dining room rather than the formal one. Edward had arranged for the meal himself, requesting all of Catherine's favorite dishes, and he saw her eyes widen with surprise and pleasure when she saw what had been prepared. "You remembered," she said softly. "I paid attention," Edward corrected. "Finally." After dinner, they walked through the house together, and Edward showed her the changes he had made during her absence. He had moved his desk out of his study and into a corner of the library, creating a shared space where they could both work and read together. He had brought fresh flowers into every room, knowing she loved them. He had even commissioned a new pianoforte, finer than the old one, and placed it in the music room where the evening light would fall across the keys. Catherine stood before the instrument, her fingers hovering over the ivory without touching it. "I stopped playing," she said quietly. "Did you know that?" "I knew," Edward replied. "I heard you once, crying in the music room, and I walked away because I did not know how to comfort you. It is one of my greatest regrets." "Play something for me now," Edward said. "Please. I want to hear the house filled with music again." Catherine hesitated, then slowly sat at the bench. She placed her hands on the keys, and after a moment's consideration, she began to play the piece Edward had found weeks ago, the one she had composed about Ashford Park. But it was different now. She had changed it, added new movements, new themes. The melancholy was still there, but woven through it were threads of hope, of tentative joy. It was a piece about transformation, Edward realized, about darkness giving way to light. When she finished, Catherine looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I wrote the beginning when I was most unhappy," she explained, "but I could not leave it there. So I wrote an ending, a hopeful one." Edward knelt beside the piano bench and took her hands. "Will you teach me to play?" he asked. "I want to learn. I want us to make music together." Catherine smiled, a real smile, radiant and unguarded. "Yes," she said, "I will teach you." That night, for the first time in their marriage, Edward asked if he might come to Catherine's chambers. He did not presume, did not demand. He simply asked, making clear that a refusal would be accepted without resentment. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "you may come." Edward was gentle with her, more careful than he had ever been with anything in his life. He kissed her slowly, reverently, taking time to learn what she liked, what made her breath catch. And when they finally came together, it was not with the detached efficiency that had characterized their few previous attempts at intimacy, but with genuine feeling, tender and awkward and real. Afterward, they lay in the darkness, Catherine's head on Edward's chest, his arms around her. He felt her heartbeat gradually slow, felt her breathing deepen as she relaxed against him. "Edward," she murmured, half asleep. "Yes, I love you." The words struck him with the force of revelation. Edward felt his throat tighten, felt something vast and overwhelming expand in his chest. He had never said those words to anyone, had never expected to say them. But now, with Catherine warm and trusting in his arms, he found they came easily. "I love you too," he whispered into her hair. "Catherine, I love you, and I will spend every day proving it." She made a small, contented sound and burrowed closer to him. "Good," she murmured, "because I'm not yours anymore the way I was before. I belong to myself first, but I choose to share myself with you. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," Edward said, and realized he truly did. "Yes, I understand." They fell asleep, tangled together, and when Edward woke in the grey light of dawn with Catherine still in his arms, he felt something he had never experienced before: peace. Not the brittle, fragile peace of enforced control, but the deep, genuine peace that comes from finally allowing oneself to be vulnerable, to be seen, to be loved. It would not be easy, Edward knew. Old habits would resurface. He would stumble, would fail, would forget and have to be reminded. There would be arguments and misunderstandings and moments when the old distance threatened to reassert itself. But there would also be this: Catherine's laughter echoing through the music room, their hands intertwined as they walked through the gardens, the joy of discovering each other, properly, layer by layer, building something real from the ruins of what had almost been lost. Edward tightened his arms around his sleeping wife and made a silent promise to the man he used to be, the man who had been so afraid of feeling that he had chosen numbness instead. That man was gone now, and in his place was someone new, someone who understood that true strength lay not in control, but in surrender, not in independence, but in interdependence, not in safety, but in the willingness to risk everything for something worth having. Edward Ashford, the 5th Earl of Greystone, had finally learned how to love, and he would spend the rest of his life being grateful that it was not too late.